the thing about doing this kind of thing is you delegate these big jobs. You know, I never organized that thing that we did, not really.
Yeah.
But what did I do? I approved the place. You know, I thought that you would be a great person to do it.
He's been called cold, untouchable, a man who treats relationships like tour dates, here for a season and gone by the next city. That's the image that's followed Mick Jagger for 6 decades. So it's strange that turning 82 this year, when someone finally asked him a simple question, who did you actually love? His answer wasn't a list of hit songs or sold-out stadiums. It was 5 names. 2 of them will surprise you. One of them he still can't fully talk about without pausing. Here's what he's actually said, across decades of interviews, about the people behind the image. The question that stopped him mid-interview. Ask Mick Jagger about the greatest performers he's known, and he'll talk for an hour without blinking. Ask him who he loved, and something changes. Over the years, in interview after interview, radio appearances, tributes, memorial services, he's answered a version of that question piece by piece, never all at once. Never as a tidy list. Put those answers together, though, and a pattern shows up that most people never notice, because nobody ever asked him to say it all in one place. Here's a scene that shows exactly what that pattern looks like. Inside a church in Manhattan in the spring of 2014, a room full of people expected the usual thing at a memorial service. A few words, maybe a shared memory, then a quiet exit. Instead, when it was his turn, Jagger stood up and sang. He chose a Bob Dylan song, not a speech, while his own son and the woman's niece read poems, and his grandchildren read a psalm aloud to the room. That's not a small gesture from a man who's spent 60 years being described as guarded, distant, incapable of really letting anyone in. It's the kind of thing you only do for someone who mattered more than the cameras in the room did. Jagger's public persona was built on distance. The strut, the smirk, the reputation for moving through relationships and friendships, the way most people move through hotel rooms. That image sold records for 50 years, and it was reinforced by a personal life that, on paper, looks exactly like the tabloids always claimed. 2 marriages, both of which ended, and 8 children born to 5 different women across more than 4 decades. His first marriage, to Bianca Jagger, lasted less than a decade and ended in a courtroom that became something of a media circus itself, with Bianca reportedly walking out, declaring the marriage over the moment it was finalized. His second, to Jerry Hall, technically had its legal validity disputed for years afterward, since the ceremony took place on the Indonesian island of Bali, under a marriage law that a British court later ruled didn't actually apply to a British citizen. On top of all that, Jagger was knighted in 2003 for his services to popular music, an honor that was actually delayed by roughly a year amid public debate over whether a lifelong rock and roll rebel should even accept a royal title in the first place, an irony that reportedly amused Jagger more than it bothered him. It would be easy to look at that history and at a public image built almost entirely around never staying anywhere for long, and conclude he simply isn't built for lasting attachment. That's what the church scene doesn't fit. Neither does what came after it, because Jagger didn't just sing that day and move on. He's kept marking the same date every year since. A habit that's outlasted most people's patience for public grief. Go back through what he's actually said when the cameras weren't asking about the next album, in radio interviews, in written tributes, in the words he chose at that service and others like it, and a completely different person shows up. Not colder with age, if anything, more open. He's talked about missing people he hasn't spoken about in decades. He's admitted to regrets he never resolved. None of that fits the image of the man who supposedly never let anyone get close. So here's what's actually true. 5 people kept coming up, again and again, whenever Jagger was asked about the ones who mattered most. Some of them are exactly who you'd expect from a Rolling Stones frontman. 1 or 2 are not. And the reasons he gives for loving each of them have almost nothing to do with fame, and almost everything to do with the version of himself nobody else got to see. Let's start with the one whose name comes up more than almost anyone else, the man Jagger has spent longer with than most people spend with their own families. The one he called 99% Love. Keith Richards is not a surprising name on this list. What's surprising is how Jagger and Richards have actually described their relationship, because it's nothing like the tabloid version. For decades, gossip columns have painted them as bitter rivals, barely tolerating each other. 2 egos sharing one stage out of financial necessity. Richards himself shut that story down directly, describing his feelings toward Jagger as loving the man the overwhelming majority of the time, admitting the 2 of them argue, admitting fame complicates things between old friends, but insisting the friction was always smaller than people assumed. The 2 actually met twice. First as young children, attending the same primary school in Dartford, Kent, and then again years later on a train platform, where Richards spotted Jagger carrying a stack of imported American blues records under his arm. That chance reunion, built entirely around a shared obsession with obscure blues and rhythm and blues records neither of them could easily find in England at the time, is what actually led to them forming a band together in 1962. What often gets left out of that story is that the 2 of them briefly lived together in a cramped, famously filthy flat in London during the band's earliest days, an experience Richards has described as some of the most broke, hungry, and genuinely happy months of his life, precisely because there was nothing at stake yet, except the music itself. Jagger has echoed that same idea of a deeper bond from his side. What's kept them close isn't the absence of conflict, it's what happens after it. Richards has said that writing a song Jagger doesn't connect with genuinely bothers him, not out of ego, but because getting Jagger excited about the material is part of his actual job as a songwriting partner, and he considers it his own failure when it doesn't land, not Jagger's. The 2 are still credited jointly as songwriters on nearly every major Rolling Stones song, a partnership nicknamed the Glimmer Twins, one they've maintained even through years where they reportedly barely spoke outside of actual band business, including a widely reported cold stretch in the mid-1980s when both men released solo albums and seemed genuinely uncertain whether the band would continue at all. Things got noticeably frostier again in 2010 when Richards published his memoir, Life, which included several unflattering personal details about Jagger, reportedly leaving the singer privately hurt and publicly tight-lipped about the book for some time afterward, before the 2 eventually moved past it and kept working together anyway, which itself says something about how durable the partnership actually is. That's not the language of 2 men just tolerating each other for a paycheck. That's the language of 2 people who've spent 6 decades trying to make each other proud. Jagger has talked about how strange it feels now, deep into their 80s and late 70s, to still be finishing each other's musical sentences the way they did as teenagers in the 1950s. Neither of them uses the word easily in interviews, but when pressed, both have landed on some version of the same idea. Whatever else changed about their lives, whatever fights happened along the way, the bond never actually broke. But Richards isn't the only bandmate Jagger has spoken about in terms that go far beyond music. There's someone else, a man who almost never wanted the spotlight at all, whose loss hit Jagger in a way that even he seemed surprised by. The steady heartbeat he still hears in rehearsals. Charlie Watts joined the Rolling Stones in 1963 as a jazz drummer who wasn't even sure he wanted to be in a rock band at all. He'd actually written and illustrated a book years earlier as a young art school graduate, chronicling the life of jazz saxophonist Charlie Parker, and never fully let go of that identity, often saying rock and roll was simply the job that paid for his real passion. Away from the band, he spent much of his life and money on a jazz big band of his own, one he'd assembled specifically to play the kind of music he actually preferred. And he was also known for breeding Arabian horses on a farm in rural England, a hobby almost nobody associated with the Rolling Stones would have guessed. One story about Watts and Jagger has circulated for years as rock and roll legend, that Watts once punched Jagger in the face during a drunken argument in Amsterdam in 1984, supposedly after Jagger phoned his hotel room late at night and referred to him as "my drummer." The tale, first published in Richards's own memoir, became one of the most repeated stories about the band's history. Yet Jagger himself has since flatly denied it ever happened, calling the whole account invented, a small but telling detail about how differently the two men remember, or choose to represent, their own shared past. He ended up staying with the band for the rest of his life, right up until his death in 2021 at 80 years old, having missed part of that year's tour due to a health issue that turned out to be far more serious than initially described. When Jagger spoke about him afterward, in an interview on the Howard Stern radio show, he didn't lead with Watts's skill behind the kit, though he had plenty to say about that too. He led with Watts's character. Jagger described him as the heartbeat of the band, a steady, reliable presence who never behaved like a diva, which Jagger pointed out is exactly what you don't want in a drummer prone to demanding attention. Watts, for his part, had once returned the compliment publicly, calling Jagger the best frontman working today, someone who took the job of performing deadly seriously and kept himself in remarkable shape for it. Jagger talked about Watts's dry sense of humor and about a side of their relationship that had nothing to do with music at all, the two of them going to football matches and cricket games together for years. Just two friends with shared interests outside the industry that made them famous. Watts was also famously the only member of the band who reportedly never fully embraced the excess that defined the group's reputation in the 1970s. And he later spoke candidly about a difficult period of his own in the mid-1980s that he worked hard to move past, coming out the other side and settling into what friends described as a quiet, disciplined domestic life. When Watts became ill in the final years of his life, he reportedly told the band not to stop touring on his account, and they carried on, carrying his absence with them the whole time, with drummer Steve Jordan stepping in to finish the tour. Jagger has said that even now, during rehearsals, band members will catch themselves saying Charlie would have done this, or Charlie would have said that, like his presence never fully left the room. That's a strange thing to admit publicly, that decades after someone's gone, you still expect to see them. But it says something about how deeply Watts was woven into not just the sound of the band, but the daily rhythm of Jagger's actual life. And it wasn't only bandmates who left that kind of gap behind. One of Jagger's closest friendships was with another British icon entirely, a friendship built on something rarer than admiration, real creative competition. The friendship that competed before it connected. Long before David Bowie became one of the most recognizable names in music, he and Jagger were already close, hanging around the same London parties in the early 1970s, showing up at each other's houses to play new material before it was ever released. Jagger has described watching Bowie develop as an artist as one of the things he genuinely enjoyed about their friendship, a front-row seat to someone reinventing himself again and again, recalling being played early mixes of songs that Bowie was still shaping at the time. But it wasn't a simple, easy friendship, and Jagger has never pretended otherwise. He's openly admitted there was a running competitive edge between them, a constant, half-joking exchange of ideas, styles, even dance moves, with Bowie occasionally borrowing something of Jagger's and being upfront enough to admit exactly where it came from. Jagger has said he never minded the borrowing because Bowie gave just as much back, calling it a genuine two-way exchange rather than one-sided theft. That competitive streak occasionally spilled into public view too, most notably when Bowie once joked in an interview that Jagger's stage moves would look, in his words, ridiculous on a man in his 60s, a comment Jagger reportedly found more amusing than insulting, given how long the two of them had been needling each other by that point. Their closest stretch came in the 1980s, when both of them were living it up in New York City, hitting the same downtown dance clubs, a period Jagger has pointed to as the reason his cover of Dancing in the Street, which the two of them filmed and recorded together in under a single day for a charity broadcast, remains one of his favorite memories of their friendship, alongside naming Bowie's own song Let's Dance as a personal favorite because it takes him straight back to that specific window of time. The two also reportedly spent time together writing material that never saw release, trading half-finished lyrics back and forth, purely for their own amusement, rather than any planned album. But the friendship didn't stay that close forever. By the time Bowie died in 2016, the two men had drifted, going long stretches without speaking, and Jagger has since admitted that's one of his genuine regrets. That Bowie's final album seemed to be nudging him to reach out, and he didn't do it in time. That album, Black Star, was released on Bowie's 69th birthday, only 2 days before his death, the result of an 18-month cancer battle Bowie had deliberately kept almost entirely private, known only to his closest family and a small circle of collaborators, which meant most of the public, Jagger included, had no real warning that the end was anywhere near. When the news of Bowie's death broke, Jagger posted publicly that he was still absorbing the loss of a friend he'd known for so many decades. A rare moment of him speaking about grief in real time rather than after some distance had passed. That kind of regret doesn't show up for people who never really mattered to you. It shows up for the ones who did. Bowie, Watts, and Richards all came from the same world Jagger built his life inside of: music, fame, the industry. But the next person on this list predates all of that, and their relationship was far more complicated than simple admiration. The father who never wanted him on a stage. Basil Fanshawe Jagger, known to everyone as Joe, was a physical education teacher and academic who spent his career trying to instill discipline, structure, and physical fitness into his son, and very little else. Jagger has said plainly that his father was firmly against him going into the arts in any form, wanting instead for Mick to pursue something more conventional, more academic, and Mick did in fact go on to study at the London School of Economics before music took over completely. Joe Jagger wasn't a severe or harsh father by Mick's own account, but he also wasn't especially affectionate, described instead as someone who quietly shaped his son through physical activity rather than emotional closeness, taking him rock climbing, canoeing, and through endless hours of sport, effectively acting as his personal trainer throughout childhood. There's even old television footage from 1959 showing a 15-year-old Mick Rock climbing at a sandstone outcrop in Kent, while his father narrates the demonstration for a sports program. A strange early record of the two of them together years before anyone had heard of the Rolling Stones. Joe's day job eventually took him beyond ordinary school teaching altogether, into a lecturing post training future physical education teachers at a college in Twickenham, meaning the values he pushed on Mick at home were the same ones he was professionally paid to instill in other people's children. Mick's mother, Eva, worked as a hairdresser and was, by most family accounts, the more openly nurturing of the two parents, which meant the two sides of Mick's upbringing pulled in noticeably different emotional directions. Academic discipline actually ran in the family, since Mick's own paternal grandfather had also worked as a teacher, meaning Joe's insistence on structure and education wasn't just personal preference, but something closer to a family expectation passed down another generation. When Jagger started performing with a band as a teenager in the early 1960s, his father was reportedly discouraged by the decision for close to a year, unable to see where it might lead. And family letters from that period show Joe expressing genuine confusion over why his academically gifted son wanted to spend his time in smoky clubs instead of finishing his studies. Joe reportedly only agreed to help buy instruments for Mick's early band once it became clear his son was serious, standing quietly in the background of music shops while Mick worked out what equipment the group actually needed. Interestingly, by the time Mick's younger brother, Chris Jagger, also chose a career in music years later, Joe's resistance had noticeably softened, no longer treating a life in the arts as something worth actively discouraging, a small but telling sign of how much his position had shifted once he'd already watched one son succeed at it. Jagger has since said that his father eventually came around once he saw something real was actually happening, and by most accounts, Joe Jagger lived to see his son become one of the most famous musicians alive, and eventually knighted, watching a version of success he never would have predicted or chosen for him, before passing away in 2006 at the age of 93, having lived long enough to watch his son's career stretch across 5 full decades. What's striking is how Jagger talks about this relationship now, not with resentment over the lack of early support, but with a kind of appreciation for exactly what his father did give him: structure, physical discipline, and a work ethic that arguably kept him performing well into his 80s. Decades passed, when most rock stars have slowed down or stopped entirely. It's a different kind of love story than the ones built on constant affection, one built instead on discipline passed quietly from father to son, useful in ways neither of them could have predicted at the time. But if that relationship shows a complicated, understated kind of love, the next person on Jagger's list represents the opposite. A loss so direct and so devastating that Jagger has never fully found the words for it, even years later. The love he still can't fully explain losing. Elren Scott, a fashion designer and stylist, met Jagger at a photo shoot in 2001. Before they met, Scott had already built a serious career of her own, working as a stylist for major names including Madonna and Nicole Kidman, before eventually launching her own high-end fashion label under her own name, a business that dressed a number of well-known actresses on red carpets over the years. Born Luann Bambro in Utah, she was adopted as an infant, grew up under the name that would later become Loren, and initially worked as a towering runway and catalog model in Paris and Tokyo, standing several inches over 6 feet tall, before transitioning into styling work behind the camera once her modeling career slowed. They were together for more than a decade, splitting their time between London and New York, with Scott designing several of the elaborate stage outfits Jagger wore on Rolling Stones tours. Pieces built around themes he said he specifically wanted to feel magical and theatrical on stage, including outfits inspired by butterflies, released during one of the band's most famous concerts decades earlier. Her label, launched formally in 2006 after several years of smaller custom projects, was built around fitted, structured silhouettes aimed at a distinctly grown-up, glamorous customer, and by 2010, it had grown popular enough that she launched a more affordable diffusion collection with the retailer Banana Republic, introducing her particular style of tailoring to a far wider audience than her usual small luxury clientele. In the years leading up to her death, Scott's fashion label had reportedly been struggling financially, weighed down by debt that friends said had begun to seriously affect her, even as she continued presenting collections and maintaining a public image of success. In March of 2014, Scott died at her Manhattan apartment at 49 years old. Jagger's statement afterward remains one of the most direct personal things he's ever put into public words. He described her as his lover and his best friend, said he was still struggling to understand what had happened, and said they had spent many wonderful years together building a genuinely good life. He said her talent was widely admired, and added that he was one of the people who admired it most. In the immediate aftermath, the band postponed the remainder of an international tour out of respect for what he was going through. An unusual step for a group known for rarely canceling scheduled dates. At her memorial service at a church in Manhattan, Jagger didn't just offer a few words. He sang, choosing a Bob Dylan song for the occasion, while his son James and Scott's niece read poems, and his grandchildren read a psalm aloud to the room, with friends including a well-known actress and a longtime fashion editor also speaking that day. In the years since, Jagger has continued marking her birthday publicly, posting photos of her with simple messages, remembering her, wishing her a happy birthday, small gestures that have continued years after her death, long after most public tributes like that tend to quietly stop, even drawing some public criticism from people who blamed him for contributing to her struggles. Criticism Jagger has never publicly responded to directly. He's said plainly that he will never forget her. Whatever the exact nature of grief looks like for someone who has spent 60 years performing in front of millions of people, this is one of the only times the mask has ever fully come off in public. It's also, arguably, the clearest answer to the entire question posed at the start of all this. Not what made him a legend. Who made him human? What 5 decades of loss taught a rock star about love? Look at these 5 people together, and something becomes obvious that none of them share in common with each other, except for their place in Jagger's life. Keith Richards, the creative partner he's spent 60 years arguing with and writing with in equal measure, going all the way back to a chance meeting on a train platform as teenagers. Charlie Watts, the quiet, steady presence whose absence still shows up in rehearsals years later. The jazz drummer who never wanted to be a rock star, but ended up loved like family anyway. David Bowie, the friend and rival whose loss came with a regret Jagger never got to resolve. A friendship built on genuine creative competition rather than simple flattery. His father, Joe, whose love looked like discipline instead of affection, structure instead of warmth, and turned out to matter just as much as either would have. And Loren Scott, the one loss Jagger has never fully packaged into a tidy public statement, because some losses simply don't get tidier with time, no matter how many decades pass or how many birthdays go by. None of them were chosen because they were famous. They were chosen because of what happened in the rooms nobody else got to see. The ordinary conversations, the small routines, the version of Jagger that existed apart from the stage persona that made him famous in the first place. The same persona that's carried him through 8 children, 2 marriages, and a public image built almost entirely around detachment. There's a small telling detail that ties the father story directly back to the rest of this list. Jagger has openly said that when it comes to his own children's interest in the arts, His approach is the opposite of what his own father gave him. If one of his kids wants to take acting classes, his answer is simply to let them. No discouragement. No year of quiet disappointment first. That's not a small shift. It suggests the lessons he actually carried forward from Joe weren't about steering people away from what they love, but about showing up for them once they've chosen it. It's worth noting, too, that 3 of the 5 people on this list are no longer alive, which means a meaningful portion of what Jagger has said about loving them has come in the specific, unguarded language people reach for only after a loss. Eulogies, birthday tributes to someone who can't read them, answers given on a radio show instead of a scripted press release. It's also worth remembering that the 2 people on this list who are still alive, Richards most of all, remain very much a working part of Jagger's daily life rather than a memory, which means at least part of this list isn't really about loss at all. It's about a friendship that simply hasn't ended yet, however many decades it's already lasted. At 82, having outlived several of the people on that list, and having spent decades being described in print as a man incapable of real attachment, Jagger has said something that sounds almost obvious once you hear it, but very few people in his position ever actually say out loud that fame gave him a reason to meet these people. But it was never fame that made him love them. So, which kind of love do you think leaves a bigger mark? The one you get to keep for 60 years? Or the one you lose before you're ready to? If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales. And hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.